Hello and welcome to another edition of Crapper. Now, something I noticed in the news recently was that there was a protest in the United States called No Kings. To me it seemed a slightly ambiguous affair. But talking about ambiguous protests to kings, let's flash back to 1974 when Gentle Giant were doing their political album, The Power and the Glory. Is it political or is it an anti-political album? That's something we might exercise our prerogative coming back to at some point. It's also something of a concept album, right? Again, slightly ambiguously, because the theme is very vague and it hasn't got a story, hasn't got a plot in the way that other famous concept albums claim to have a plot, even if they haven't actually got one. I refer the audience to our recent Tommy versus Quadrophenia episodes that me and Peter did. This, of course, was the follow-up, The Power and the Glory, to In a Glass House, an album I analysed recently on this channel, on this pod. And In a Glass House, I argued, had a sort of implicit concept, a form of existentialism. But yeah, The Power and the Glory seems to have a more explicit concept. At least there's sort of cross-references between the songs and things. So perhaps we could say that this is a little bit like the transition from Aqualung to Thick as a Brick in the famous Jethro Tull catalogue. What is the concept? Yes, good question. As I said, it's ambiguous. I think it was Derek Schulman said that it was something related to Watergate, because the Watergate scandal was happening around the same time, in which, what happened in Watergate? Well, Richard Nixon was accused of political corruption, right? Bugging the Democrats' headquarters, I think. Can't quite remember, but something like that. I can't remember because it never seemed to me to be a particularly important event. I mean, it should probably disqualify you from being president, but Americans, particularly at the time, seemed to treat it as if it was like the end of the world, politically. Apparently, Gentle Giant felt the same way. But, if you compare it to everything else that was going on in the world at that point, it seems like a storm in a teacup. But anyway, what do I know about that? Anyway, the title of this album, The Power and the Glory, actually coincides with a renowned novel by Graham Greene, the English author. English novelist, no relation to Gary Greene, the guitarist with Gentle Giant. But that appears to be not relevant here. And one shouldn't forget, I think, that the sort of doxology at the end of the Lord's Prayer, for thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory, forever and ever, amen. It seems to be essentially, this album seems to be essentially a reference to that, or the title at least. So it's a satirical piece, let's say. And, one of the tracks is called No God's a Man, so, that ties in with the doxological reference. In fact, I think the most obvious literary reference here is Animal Farm by George Orwell, because the album seems to be about a man who wants the political power to change things, but ends up sort of succumbing to power itself, right? This is why I say it could be considered an anti-political album. Because, for my money, there's a sort of anarchist fallacy involved here, what I would call an anarchist fallacy. That's to say that, the fact that power corrupts shouldn't lead one to deduce that power can be ignored completely. But, perhaps this went with the times. Rock stars at that time tended to be rather anarchistic, if not in word. And apparently they were also angry about the abuses they'd received, Gentle Giant, the abuses they'd received from their record company, right? So it seems to be something of a thematic rebellion against the master that was their record company. But as I say, it's all rather oblique. Let's do some empirifacts. This album was recorded in Advision in London, right? Where, as people may know, Yes, the band Yes, worked a lot alongside, David Bowie, Elton John, Kate Bush. Who else? Soft Machine, ELP, Queen, Rush, Jeff Wayne, David Essex. That's more of a parochial reference, I think. Pet Shop Boys. I think the Venn diagram between fans of Gentle Giant and fans of the Pet Shop Boys is the central element section is empty, probably. Anyway, it was released in 1974, this album, and it reached number 78 in the Billboard Top 200. I don't know what that means. I read it. This album was also recorded by the definitive Gentle Giant lineup, let's say, established on the previous album. Derek Shulman, Ray Shulman, the brothers, Kerry Minnear, Gary Greene and John Weathers, and they continued throughout the rest of the band's career, continued to make albums. It was the same lineup on all the rest of the Gentle Giant albums. The cover, sometimes we say a word on the cover, don't we? I think the cover reflects the sort of ambiguity of the theme because it represents the king as a playing card. In other words, power is seen here as a game, which results in a constant shifting of relative position between the players, but it doesn't have anything to do with truth, let's say. That seems to be the idea. Once again, I think this is a false deduction, but, whatever. What else? Right, well, let's go on to the tracks, shall we? Without further ado. We've got 8 tracks this time. In a Glass House, the previous album had 3. So in a sense, this is back to the sort of the format of the previous album, Octopus, where you've got 8 slots to fill up, right? And in fact, perhaps the fact that this is a sort of mild, vague, opaque concept, ambiguous concept album, might have something to do with the fact that they were trying to find a way to tie these more multitudinous pieces together. Whereas I think one of the strengths of In the Glass House was that the pieces kind of all worked in their own right. But anyway, that's a passing thought. So side 1 begins with Proclamation, the track Proclamation. Now, this is a brilliant opener to the album. I mean, I think it's so great that it explains why this album is so well thought of. Because some of the rest of the album goes a bit round the houses. But we'll get to that again later on. But the opener remains the opener, and it's bloody brilliant. This track, of course, it's reprised at the end. That's something else we might want to discuss in a little more detail. Why and whether that should happen. This track starts with some musique concrète, possibly. It's a crowd cheering, but is it really a crowd? I mean, I don't know. It's a slightly weird sounding treated crowd. Sounds slightly animalistic. That might be intentional. Because, if power corrupts, then any form of power is, any aspect of power is corrupting, isn't it? And that includes, any iteration of the people which might be implicated in this game of power. So, no one gets off, is let off the hook here, right? Anyway, the track starts with a very interesting keyboard sound. There's a sort of keyboard motif and with nice keyboard sound, sort of funky, sort of prog funky, let's say. And then gradually the whole band kind of seep in. I think what's nice about this track, the first thing to say is that Gentle Giant really don't sound like anyone else. There's no other band in history that sounds like anything like the opening to this track. And the arrangement is very characteristic of the band as well. We've also got an interesting vocal melody when it eventually comes in. including a flattened fifth in there. You know, the Devil's Interval, the famous Devil's Interval. Black Sabbath fans, take note. What occurs to me here is that the keyboard, keyboards are sort of chattering here. It's a sort of chattering sound. You know, again, apparently evoking, you know, the mob. You know, the crowd, the multitude. Right. And then when the bass comes in, it sort of anchors the motif. And I think that's almost mirrors the apparent inequality between the voice of the leader and that of the people, right? So a lot of this on this album, there's a lot of this sort of double movement between voicings, as I believe they're called. By the way, shout out to Ray Shulman here, well, the late Ray Shulman, for his amazing syncopated bass runs. They really are lovely, very tight, clean, you know, clean sounding. What else? Well, I mean, in the refrain, it starts in D. Yeah. I mean, I think what I should say actually first of all is that the chords here are sort of just hinted at in the keyboard riffs, and that's a very interesting aspect, which, as I say, no other band would think of doing. I think the chords are basically like D minor E, and then F and G, and then they go up to A with a diminished seventh, I think, and that closes the sequence. I think it's a diminished seventh. It's called a diminished seventh. I mean, who knows? We are in open water here. But yeah, so I think that what I wanted to say was that earlier is that the bass kind of precipitates that shift up from D minor to F. So it's the bass that's indicating that shift from the relative minor to the relative major, right? And the final chord, the A, has got a hail sung on top of it. Hail meaning, you know, like hail to the chief, so on and so forth. We know all those political resonances, and that's sung in as a close harmony. That word hail, and I think it might be sort of dissonant on purpose because they are singing only a semitone apart. I think one of them singing G and one of them singing F, probably the two Shulman brothers. So it sounds weird that hail is supposed to sound like, uncanny, incongruous, once again, as if the sort of popular unity that's being invoked in this political rally, because we presume that's what's going on here in the proclamation, is a false one, right? What else? Well, so the as I said before, I think they have a very unique style, compositional style and sound, Gentle Giant, and this track shows it all very clearly. What's interesting about it, I think, is that it moves in chords rather than chord sequences. This is why I've listed chords, but they're not. No one's actually playing those chords. They're just sort of intimated by the lines that are interacting with them. That's why, as I said, the shift from relative minor to major is precipitated by the just one single bass note. Right? And I think this idea of moving in chords rather than chord sequences is a sort of classical approach, really. And it probably, I guess, reflects Kerry Minnear, the keyboard player, his training at the Royal Academy of Music. And the other, perhaps classical or neoclassical element that Gentle Giant use a lot is Steve Reich's, what Steve Reich, the minimalist composer, calls augmentation, which is like filling in the gaps. So they sort of start with a sort of thin line with lots of gaps in the phrase, and then they add other things in to fill in the gaps. That's particularly what's happening between the bass and the keyboard on this opening track. So anyway, it does this whole sequence, which I've already listed twice, and then it goes into a fast unison section, this track. which then speeds up, at least sonically, because the drums double the time signature, or play it twice as fast, I should say. Then it crashes into a section in 5/4, because previous to that it had been in straight 4/4 time. That's not the first time they do that on this album, but anyway, again, we can come back to that. The 5/4 section includes various sort of counterpoints, and it moves from sort of dissonant melodies to consonant melodies, and then there's a sort of a stop time, almost, where they sing. Again, various people seem to be singing "Hail to Power and Glory's Way," and that line's repeated almost ad nauseam. And again, it's sort of the combination of notes is slightly weird and uncanny, almost supposed to sound unpleasant, I think. Once again, reminding us of this sort of, the kind of the subjective ambiguity of the crowd, in this political context. So yes, it's has a sort of unpleasant air. This middle section, but it's all quite elegant, of course. In fact, it's sort of chromatic. This section, it's just stabs, and the melody lines that are played on between the guitar and the bass are sort of chromatic. So, and this chromaticism, again, is very unusual in rock music. I think it's probably the closest that rock music comes to sort of modernist classical music, perhaps one could say. Then the track fades out after this sort of complicated, confusing middle section, and then we get the ending to the piece, which is basically a faster reprise of the first bit. Actually, I found the end of this track a little disappointing, I have to say. It's like a sort of deja vu, I think. It's all going great, this track. And then suddenly they just start repeating the beginning again. And this last bit sounds quite bracing, superficially, but to me it feels a bit repetitive. And that's just my point of view. I think this is a wonderful opening piece, but this last bit, I think, kind of sells it a bit short. And then to add insult to injury, as it were, it just fades out at the end. Yeah, I'm not a fan of fade outs, really, as I think I've made clear on previous episodes. So I think they had a couple of options here that they pointedly refused to take. I think they could have just faded the track out early, like when the middle section just dies down to nothing. It's not really a fade out, but it dies down to nothing. They could have just stopped there, I think, because after all, this is a concept album, so why not write it as a concept album with tracks kind of like bleeding into each other? In fact, the truth is that this is only really a concept album in terms of the lyrics. Gentle Giant generally didn't do writing that was fitted to non-musical formats, right? And so in that sense, this is why I said before in the previous episode that I think that they're more like a sublimated pop band than a prog band. But anyway, so yeah, they could have just allowed the track to die away to nothing and then got on with the second track, I think. I think the second option would have been to do what they did on Playing the Fool, which is actually to go into the final track on the album, Valedictory, which we'll come back to later, which is also a reprise of the opening section, but it's slower, and therefore it feels more dramatic and a bit more appropriate because it's slightly desperate sounding, which might not make it the best ending to the album, but it could have made it an appropriate ending to this track. And yeah, I find it interesting that they did that on Playing the Fool, almost as if they knew that what I was saying about the original ending not being quite right was true. But who am I to say whether I'm right on this point or not? I will just say that Gentle Giant seemed to agree with me. Anyway, what about the words here? It's a proclamation, according to them. But of what? I don't know. I am you, you are me. That seems to be what they're saying. The leader is the people. But, in what iteration? I mean, I think they leave it open, which is probably wise, but not especially helpful if you're expecting like a full-on concept album. I mean, perhaps you don't feel like you learn much from leaving this all rather open and ambiguous. I mean, this ambiguity that they're referring to actually is a conceptual ambiguity, which is very conventional because, let's see if I can find the book. Here we go. Thomas Hobbes, famous book written around the time of the English Civil War. Can you see that? This cover apparently is based on, I mean, this isn't going to come out on the podcast, but the cover of Leviathan, if you can see that anywhere, either in your own library or online, the cover that's sort of widely accepted as the cover to this book is apparently based on a sketch by the author himself, Thomas Hobbes. And this book is about this figure called the Leviathan, who's a king-like figure, really. But in this image, his body is made up of all the bodies of the people, in the social, ordinary people, as it were, in the social contract. So there's a kind of, according to Hobbes, there's a kind of transference between ordinary people and the king, right? Which is what makes a society work, right? Gentle Giants seem to be questioning this, but there's also a sort of fatalism in their argument, which means that they're questioning it, but also they seem to be concluding that it couldn't be any other way, right? So this can only lead us, as I said, to a sort of anarchistic conclusion, right? All right, let's leave that there. Track 2, So Sincere. Apparently this is a fan favourite. This is on, did this one live a lot. This is a nice track, I think, but it pales slightly for my money in comparison to the first track, because I think we're still dealing here with the fallout of this astonishing first track. This is sort of a contrast, at least at the beginning, and that seems to have been the idea behind this track. Whether or not this is as harmonically interesting as the previous track, I don't know. I don't think it necessarily is, but I mean, that's perhaps a matter of taste. This track starts balladic, as it were, with some nice, lovely violin playing by Ray Shulman. Once again, there's no chords here. It's just sort of dissonant riffs, kind of creating a mood. And the signifier of it being a ballad is that Kerry Minnear is doing his quasi-choral singing, which is very beautiful. And is usually employed by Gentle Giant when they're doing a quiet section. And then the chorus comes in right rocky, it does. It's an overdriven guitar. Derek Shulman starts singing with his incredibly powerful voice. So again, that's the signifier that things are picking up. So it alternates between these two moments, the ballad and the rock, the balladic verse and the rocky chorus. So it's a sort of classical rock construction in that sense, this piece. In the chorus, they're singing so sincere over and over again. Again, not a great tune, but I think it doesn't matter too much because the mood at this point is carried by the band, basically. It's verse, chorus, guitar solo, verse, chorus, this track. And the final chorus is done as a musicus interruptus. Does that make sense? It's just kind of the track just disappears at a certain point. One thing I wanted to mention here, apropos of nothing, is that there's a hilariously complicated piano run at the end of the guitar solo. And anybody who's heard this track will know what I'm talking about. It's about 3 minutes in, just about 3:05, and it reminds me that bit of, funnily enough, of Condé Nancarrow's pianola music. I don't know if that was an influence, but it wouldn't surprise me. I reckon they were very eclectic, this band, especially Kerry Minnear. And if that's true, if there are things like that in here, then it makes clear there's kind of breadth of musical influences on this band. Lyrics here, everything is so sincere, regardless of whether it's right or wrong. So again, I've got the anti-political theme in here. Because if there's no such thing as political truth, then basically you have to give up on politics altogether, don't you? That seems to be their position. But anyway, we can leave that to one side. Now, track 3 is called Aspirations. This is a full-on ballad. Got a nice sort of jazzy feel, this one. Balladic, but jazzy. I think perhaps because of the sort of omnipresent electric piano, I assume it is played by Kerry Minnear. Again, the ballad form makes perfect sense programmatically here. You've got slightly more conventional harmony on this one. Right. And again, Kerry Minnear is singing, doing his choral singing. And it is lovely that. I mean, that almost just the mood of him singing over the electric piano kind of makes the track in itself, I think. It's so emblematic. So sincere, perhaps you could say. And that track, So Sincere, is referenced again in the lyrics here, reminding that this is a concept album, or a quasi-concept album, as it were. Now, I think what's interesting about this track, melodically and harmonically, is that it's in A, but it's neither major nor minor. It's just they're just playing a second, so it's just a B. It's not a C or a C sharp. C would indicate that it's minor. C sharp would indicate it's major. They're just playing the second, so it's kind of left. As it were, how we're supposed to feel about this track is left open. How this track is supposed to make us feel is left to us to decide. Maybe that's a sort of anarchistic thing. That's the sort of democratic moment. Like, we're not going to decide for you how you feel. You decide how you feel. There is a melody that kind of snakes its way over the top of the chords in this track. But again, it includes both major and minor thirds, this melody. So the ambiguous mood is not really broken. Which again, as I say, sort of fits the theme. Has to do with the sort of, programmatically, it has to do with the expectancy of the multitude, because they sing, "It is all in you," right? And they're singing that to the Leviathan. I'm just calling it the Leviathan now. The main character of this concept album. So because the protagonist here is the crowd in this one, so that's when they say it's all in you. They're talking to the Leviathan. Actually, politically, it could be considered slightly offensive, that idea, but sort of poo-pooing the intellect of the crowd. But anyway. Always a risk in this kind of these kind of theoretical constructions. Okay, track 4, Playing the Game. Now, as I sort of was kind of intimating, perhaps the previous 2 ballads lose some urgency in comparison to the opening number, right? I find them slightly pootling, particularly So Sincere. But again, I think because this is a concept album, in inverted commas, it doesn't matter too much because, as I say, it's larger scale. And so you're always waiting for the next thing. Now, here is the next thing, Playing the Game, because I really like this number. And by the way, it's slightly longer, this song, almost as if they knew which tracks to foreground and extend and which tracks were interludes. Basically the ballads are interludes. But this track starts with a very nice, sort of striking marimba part. Sort of rhythmically interesting. Dun, 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 That goes like that. And once again, it's augmented, this part, gradually, with the band, but also like a ringing telephone. So we've got some more nice music concrete in there. Lovely. So yeah, it builds up nice, this one. It is weird, though, because the start seems to be... I mean, the chords here are just mad. It seems to be in E minor at the beginning. And then there's a sort of fanfare played as an ostinato, which would fit with the theme, because, you know, you'd have a fanfare for a godlike king, wouldn't you? A Leviathan. But the fanfare is actually in D major. So the main theme seems to be in a completely different key to the harmony, which is mad and fun. It somehow works. Somehow. I don't know how they make it work, but they do. But, you know, this shows how what sort of a wide musical imagination they have, you know. Expansive musical imagination this band has. So, yeah, we've got this, as I say, this ostinato guitar fanfare main theme bit. And the bass notes change under it, echoing the introduction. And then we have sort of, I think, what is a candidate for the craziest chord sequence in the history of rock. You've got C, I've written it down, C, F minor, C sharp, E minor, A, C sharp minor, F sharp minor, B, E, then back to D. Go figure. If you just played those chords in a row, you'd think, right, I'm just playing random chords. But the way that they construct a track on top of this sequence is just beautiful. Later on in the track, they abbreviate this sequence in various ways. Now, once again on this track, we have the Schulman-Minneer dialectic, let's call it. Because the main song here is quite upbeat. Sort of walking pace, I would say. And then again, it goes into a central choral section. And then we end up finally at the more rocky part again at the end. In fact, after the choral section, there's actually a nice keyboard solo. Right. So, to me, this feels like a perfect prog structure, this track. It's a rocky part, quiet part, kind of raucous keyboard part, and then a reprise of the rocky part at the beginning. So it's perfectly constructed, this track. Very exciting. Love it. The lyrics here are about the main character, the Leviathan, let's say, as we're calling him, realizing that he is unassailable, basically. There's a line which says, "No words that I'm the knave can alter my philosophy." The knave, of course, is another reference to cards, because the cover I forgot to mention is a playing card, and it's the king from playing cards. So again, we've got this idea of games, and the knave is the jack, of course, and the knave also means, you know, a moral brigand. But again, you know, as I say, deeply ambiguous. If it's all a game, then why does it matter? But anyway. Never mind. These are the choices they're making. Okay, let's go to side 2. Side 2 opens with the excellent track Cogs In Cogs. I think this is a key track structurally in the album, partly because of the lyrics, what it's actually about, this track, but also because of its position in the album. You know, track 1, side 2 is an important moment in any album, but perhaps even more so in a concept album, because you're into really the second half here, right? So they've got to keep the intellectual energy going here, right? And boy, do they do it. In fact, this track reminds me slightly of the tracks on In a Glass House. That's how good it is. It reminds me of those tracks sort of in terms of mood and structure. It's extremely complex, this track, and also rockier than any of the previous tracks. Right? So, in that sense, it's a bit of a classic. This one, it goes straight to the heart of their artistry. I think straight to the heart of their aesthetic, as it were. Now, at this point in the story, I should say, the multitude are getting dissatisfied because they feel that nothing's happening. Hence, Cogs in Cogs, right? So the machine continues to whir, but nothing changes, I guess. That seems to be the point here. So that's why it's a kind of tense, angry, rocky song, right? And it also evokes, of course, kind of industrial alienation in our modern bureaucratized societies, a motif that's been discussed ad nauseam in the sociological literature, think Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin. Right. And I think the musically interesting thing about this track is its, as I say, as I've sort of intimated, its programmatic aspect. The lyrical theme is fairly simple, but the musical treatment, I think, is extremely intelligent here. Because inevitably they're making the musical part sound mechanical, and the individual musical motifs are themselves like cogs, right? So there's lots of repetition, and the way that the melody line develops is through subtle, almost imperceptible shifts, right? Plus, of course, they're using their full arsenal of vocal techniques to evoke the main idea, rounds, cannons, etc., especially in the middle. Cogs in cogs, cogs, cogs. So I don't know what I was doing there. You need to listen to the track to find out what I mean, I guess. We won't play the track here for copyright reasons. So in conclusion, this is an energetic, exciting, and programmatically brilliant number, in which inevitably there's frequently more than one thing going on at once. And this is especially highlighted almost comically at the end, where the main riff comes back in and the tambourine seems to be playing in a different time signature to the rest of the band. So again, we've got sort of these kind of interlocking parts, but only interlocking at one point. It's very clever. They're very clever, Gentle Giant, very clever band. Anyway. Side 2, track 2 is called No God's a Man. I referenced it earlier. I think what's interesting about this one musically is that it's a waltz, right? But the drums actually come in 4/4. And this seems to continue for almost the whole track. So there's a disparity between the two main rhythms. And I think this is, again, this ambiguity is reflected in the lyrics, right? They say, the man is only a man who fails to know the people shouting for him have turned now, telling him to go. In other words, there's two things going on at once here, and the listener, not us, but the guy, the Leviathan, hasn't noticed. This made me think, actually, curiously, of, I don't know if people have ever seen this, but there's amazing footage of Ceaușescu, Nicolae Ceaușescu, I think that was his first name, Nicolae, who was the communist president of Romania. I'm on thin ice here, empirically. Or, was he the general secretary of the Romanian Communist Party? I don't know how that all works. But anyway, he was basically the leader of Romania under communism. I think it was in 1991. There's a bit famous moment where he's addressing the crowd, the audience from the balcony, and all of a sudden they just start booing him, and he doesn't know what to do. It's an amazing sort of performative political moment, that. Anyway, that it made me think of that slightly later event when I was listening to this, right? Obviously, they were ahead of their time on this point, Gentle Giant. But yeah, and yeah, I wondered, to what extent this kind of like doubling effect, you're expecting one thing and then something else actually comes back to you, was intentional, really. In any case, this effect is slightly broken up by a full-on rock guitar solo in the middle of the track. But anyway, guitarists are always doing their own thing, I suppose. Okay, side 2, track 3 is called The Face. Now, this is a lovely track. I think No God's a Man is sort of all right. It's not my favourite track on the album, but again, you don't have to wait long on this album for something really nice to come along, and this is really nice, this track, for me, the track 3, The Face. It opens with a beautiful folky violin motif, evoking the 16th century, as Gentle Giant were occasionally wont to do. So yeah, this track represents a sort of final rock out, really, with some folky pretensions. It's a final rock out because the track after it, which is the final track, seems like more of a coda than anything else. But anyway, yeah. So yeah, it really, I don't know. It's exciting, this track. It really thrums along, this one. This is in straight 4/4. This one. Harmonically, it's not more conventional, this third track, but at least it is sort of followable. Let's say. I think this track is almost like a sort of an effed up blues, because it starts in B minor. That's the home key, but then the refrain, when the violin motif comes back in, is in E minor. Now, so you've got you feel like you're experiencing a blues sequence here. Of course, the completion of a normal blues sequence would be F sharp, but actually here it's F to G, which makes no sense at all. But this is Gentle Giant. What do you expect? Still, the transition between those first two chords makes this one a bit more assimilable, I think, to the normal ear. Yeah, and as I said, I think, I love this track. I think the rocky tracks on this album really are the high points. I think they're like the bridge structure that holds the album up. The quieter parts are nice enough, but I think they're more like interludes, as I was saying earlier. And yeah, this is one of those sort of rockier, more up-tempo moments. It does have a time change in it, because after all, as I said, this is Gentle Giant. What else would you expect? So it goes into 6/8 at a couple of points. But, yeah, we were unlikely to get through this whole track unscathed, weren't we? Given that we're listening to Gentle Giant. Okay, so thematically, the whole political project that we were discussing on this album is dedicated to seems to have collapsed at this point, according to the lyrics. They say, time to confess, clean up the mess, cast off the mold, buy all you've sold. That might have been a comment directly directed at their record company. I wanted to compliment Ray Shulman and Gary Greene here, right, who do marvellous, exciting violin and guitar solos, respectively. They're so excited in these solos that at one point Derek Shulman, I think it is, shouts, "Oh yeah!" a verbal ejaculation that was wisely left in. Although I did listen to the Stephen Wilson mix, and he seems to have decided to edit that out a bit. But anyway, maybe that's something to do with the equipment I'm listening to it on. This penultimate track ends. What have I put here? Ends quizzically on an open A chord, right? As if they're leaving the sort of denouement of everything open, which once again is either a cop-out or very wise, depending on your point of view. Now, let's go to the final track. Valedictory, it's called. Now, as I said before, this is a slightly downbeat ending, this. I think it's the least interesting, of the three iterations of the main riff that the whole album started with. So I think it's a shame they left this for last. But it does rock out a bit, I suppose. So in terms of mood, it feels like an appropriate ending to the album. It could be worse. Could be the ending of side 2 of Phantasmagoria by Curved Air, which is like basically a long conceptual piece, and the ending is completely thrown away. They could have done that. They haven't done that, but I still think this is not necessarily the most satisfying ending to the album. What have we got here? We've got a rock guitar variation on the album's opening keyboard riff. And again, I do prefer this on keys, if I'm honest. Slowed right down. So the whole track is slower than the original version. And although the whole thing speeds up at the end, it just gets faster and faster and faster, as if to emphasize that you can keep moving as fast as you like, but if there's no real change, it doesn't matter. So that's another political point. Because the speed up at the end of the track just leads to a final explosion, and that's it. everything's lost, all is lost, to quote the title of a film by the late Robert Redford. And yeah, this is sort of the kind of like the hopelessness of the whole situation is kind of reflected in the words. I think the last line is "time to rearrange." Right. So this is definitely a sort of, as I said before, an Animal Farm ending. Right. It's a sort of example of what Hegel would have called bad infinity here. Hegel distinguished good infinity from bad infinity. Right. And bad infinity is when everything is endlessly moving around, changing position, politically, but nothing actually of any significance happens. And a good infinity is when something actually significant happens, right? And ironically, things stop changing for a second. So the message of Gentle Giant here, the final message seems to be that there's no room in politics for a good infinity, which I think is, as I say, it's a slightly fallacious deduction, but, fair enough. They say what they like, can't they? Do what they want, say what they want. So, yes, that's all I had to say on this fascinating little album. In conclusion, this is a full-on, albeit ambiguous concept album, for better or worse. Some very nice, exciting and interesting musical moments, sometimes played for programmatic significance. As usual, amazing playing. I think perhaps this isn't Gentle Giant's best album, but it's basically a successful album, I think, and it leads up nicely to their what I would say is their final great album, which is the following one, Freehand, which is where they managed to finally get free from their record company or whatever. But yeah, we'll get to that another day. So thanks for your attention, and please remember to give us a rating if you're on the podcast, and feel free to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want to get see more of this content, as they say, and have a good afternoon / evening, whatever's next on your agenda, and I'll see you on the next episode of Crapper. Ta-ra!